Rushing water, thundering water, carrying destruction through the peaceful valley of the Ohio. Where yesterday flowed a friendly river, today nay of flood. Unmindful of its banks, unheeding man-made obstacles, the swollen river throws its might against man and his works.
It actually started in northeast Arkansas right around New Year's. You had a lot of heavy rain in the north-south flowing rivers that go into the Mississippi. This is sharecropper country we're talking about here, where people are living on less than $200 a year, where they carry Lucky Bones in their pockets and wear red flannel next to their skin to ward off rheumatism. So these are the people who are getting hit first. They run in early January. Then all that rain over the next couple weeks is going to track right up the Ohio River all the way to Pittsburgh. By about the 24th of January, the Ohio River is insane. Then all that water is going to come back and hit northeast Arkansas again, and so it's going to be completely out of hand. So the flood really turns into an absolute crisis about the 24th or so. They call it Black Sunday. It's when Louisville was evacuated, Paducah was evacuated, cities all across the Ohio River were evacuated on Black Sunday after about 4 weeks of rain. Our Weather Bureau was not able to predict the weather very well. Essentially, they could predict about 24 hours in advance, but we didn't have satellite technology then. We didn't have as many weather stations. We didn't have as many river gauges. And so they're almost going on instinct. They had very little information. And so one of the frustrating things for many people is that the flood forecast would change every day or many times a day. It was like walking up a staircase. Every day the flood forecast gets higher and higher and higher. There were places where they were caught completely off guard, and you had Weather Bureau workers moving the river gauges farther and farther inland before they got completely covered by the water. And so in the cities, it was hard to tell exactly what was coming. There was a lot of complacency in many cities, in Louisville and Paducah and elsewhere, because they thought that they had already seen a record flood, that the flood of 1913 or 1884 was as high as the river could ever get. And then in 1937, on average, it went about 9 feet higher than existing records. So we weren't as good at predicting floods then as we are now. In a place like Cincinnati, for example, the response was pretty good once they figured out there was going to be a flood. The wealthier parts of Cincinnati are up on a bluff, and so they're flood safe. Down on the riverfront, you had a lot of poor and working class people. At first, there wasn't a lot of concern about the flood, but once it got crazy in Cincinnati, then the government did quite a good job of evacuating the areas that needed to be evacuated, of getting control over the downtown area, of rationing utilities, electricity, drinking water, for example. So in Cincinnati, that's kind of a best case scenario. In other places, the government basically just melted away. In Paducah, the government essentially ran for its life, and you had a few neighborhoods up on high ground that basically governed themselves for a couple of weeks. In some places, the relationship between the Red Cross and the local government was very good. In some places, you had incompetent local Red Cross chapters, and the government didn't work very well with them, and so there's a lot of friction there. So it's really, you have to take it on a case-by-case scenario in terms of the local response. The federal government did an outstanding job with the flood. It's fortunate in a way that the flood happened during the Depression, because there was a ready source of labor available. This is the age of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, and Franklin Roosevelt is very clear. He doesn't want red tape, he doesn't want bureaucracy, he doesn't care about regulations. If a community needs help, he's going to send in the WPA, he's going to send in the CCC, and so they were absolutely crucial in rescuing people, getting them out of their homes, saving their possessions. There was a New Deal agency called the Resettlement Administration, which cared for livestock, which would have been just wiped out. otherwise. And so they did an extraordinary job of relief. They also did an excellent job of letting the Red Cross do its work, of running refugee camps, of caring for refugees. Roosevelt was active in helping the Red Cross raise money for the crisis. So during the flood itself, it was an exceptional response. The interesting thing, if you think about comparing 1937 to disasters today, no one was saying, why hasn't Franklin Roosevelt come to see us in the flood zone? There was no expectation of a federal visit. Whereas I think about Hurricane Katrina and how much trouble George Bush got in for just flying over the area instead of actually being on the ground. Nobody expected Roosevelt to come see the flood victims. But on the whole, Washington did an extraordinary job during the flood. It's really hard to determine total damage estimates and then to convert it into today's dollars. It would run in the low billions by 1937 standards. There were towns that were completely wiped out, that never came back. Rural areas were devastated. Drinking water supplies were poisoned. Utility companies were put underwater. So it's hard to add all that up and try to put a dollar sign on it. How do you put a dollar sign on all the days of work that were lost or all the rebuilding expenses, the private industry? But it would have run into the billions even in 1937.
What about loss of life?
About 400 or so. Very few of those from drowning. There were only a handful of drowning deaths. Most of them came from pneumonia or influenza. A lot of these people who ran from the flood were rural, sharecroppers, farmers. In many cases, they had to trek through miles of open country to get to safety, to get to a refugee camp. Many of them arrive without shoes, without hats. They'll wrap a shirt or something around their head. And so they come into these crowded concentration centers hacking and wheezing. So most of the deaths are caused by pneumonia, influenza, rather than drowning. There was a case in Missouri where a barge full of levee workers went under. It sank, and about 25 people drowned from that incident. Other than that, you don't see a lot of drownings, but about 400 deaths on the whole. After 1937, there was basically an exodus from the downtown areas. That people moved out to the suburbs. They moved to high ground. But one of the things that happened because of the 1937 flood, there were some flood control acts passed that provided federal money for flood walls. Once those flood walls were built, often they're not completed until the 50s or the 60s or even the 70s, then you start to see a kind of riverfront revival of people moving back downtown, revitalizing downtown areas. Paducah is a great example of that. Also, you see communities, because of 1937, realizing that not only do we have to protect ourselves with a flood wall, there's some ground that just belongs to the river. And so a lot of those riverfront areas were cleared of housing and have become parks. In Louisville, there's a beautiful park called Waterfront Park for obvious reasons. And so the impact of the flood and the recovery of the flood, it could take decades. Now, in terms of coming home from refugee camps, that was often a period of several months. It was often not until May or June of 1937 that people went home or got to see whether they had a home anymore. There is a federal program that's created that provides some rebuilding money, but most of it's coming from the Red Cross. And they're quite generous, actually. Well, I should say Americans are generous in giving to the Red Cross, and then the Red Cross does a good job of getting that money to people, not just for rebuilding their houses, but there are cases where people lost artificial limbs, and the Red Cross paid for a new artificial limb. And so it's really the Red Cross that's the hero here in terms of helping to get people back on their feet and rebuild their properties. There's really no comparison to previous floods. There had been bad floods along the Ohio River, and have always been since there's been an Ohio River, but this is the first time that a flood hits a real industrialized Ohio Valley. In the 1880s, you don't have these big industrial cities in place, and so the damage is much greater just because of that fact. It's a different country, and the water is much higher. And so in that sense, there's really no comparison. In 1927, you had a tremendous flood along the lower Mississippi River that devastated parts of eastern Arkansas and western Mississippi down to Louisiana. It was a very different experience from 1937, not just because it hit different parts of the country, but because we'd become a different country since then. In 1927, there was very little federal involvement. Rescue and relief was left largely to the Red Cross and other private industries. Instead of the laissez-faire government of Calvin Coolidge, we have the activist government of Franklin Roosevelt. And so you have that kind of army of federal workers who can go in place, save lives, save property. And so the difference comes from the fact that we learned from 27, but also that we have a very different philosophy of government in place. I think about 2011, we had flood levels on the Ohio River that were in some places comparable to 1937, but we didn't have mass evacuations. We didn't have that kind of damage that we had in 37, and that's because of the flood walls that were put in place after 1937. It's also because there is now a series of reservoirs upstream where the Ohio begins and its tributaries begin, that can, in a time of flood, hold back water, retain water, and keep it from adding to the flood. And so really, the modern Ohio Valley is a product of 1937. The towns as they are, the river as it is, the flood protection as it is, it all comes from this Depression-era incident.